Today is Wednesday, April 10th, and it's 1 o'clock, so it's time for our Greek reading studies. And in today's lesson, we're going to study verses 11 through 15 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. I'm going to share my screen here so we can see the text. This is the text on the Academy website, and I've got it blown up so it should be legible for others watching the video. But this is on the Academy website, linked to the Study Center lesson, and I've made it. I've improved the formatting a little bit so it's even easier to read. We're going to go through verses 11 through 15 here in Greek. We'll practice reading. I'm going to read through it, and I'll just take my time and give students a chance to read through it for themselves and then compare their reading to mine. Because, after I don't know how many years, 30 years of study, I think I've got Greek pronunciation figured out well enough to help students. But we'll go through the pronunciation and read through it, and then we'll go through the exposition one word at a time. I'll make some comments on the vocabulary and things like that. And we'll be hard pressed to get through this in an hour, so I'm going to move along pretty quickly, so bear with me, all right? We've got the text here up on the screen, so what I'd like you to do is just take a few seconds and read verse 11 to yourselves, just practicing pronunciation. Try to read it as clearly as you can, and then I'll read it and you can compare your pronunciation to mine. So go ahead and read verse 11. All right, let's walk through it one word at a time. Verse 11, this first word is ace, ace. Then we have ta idia, ta idia. You see that iota has a soft breathing mark and an acute accent, ta idia. We then have eilthen. Notice that the eta has a soft breathing mark with a circumflex accent, eilthen. Eis ta idia eilthen, kai. Then we have hoi idioi, auton, that's a diphthong, parelabon, parelabon. Verse 11, eis ta idia eilthen, kai hoi idioi auton parelabon. One more time. Eis ta idia eilthen, kai hoi idioi auton parelabon. All right, verse 11. Let's go down to the exposition here. So we see this first word, ace, is a preposition. It's followed by an accusative. So ace ta idia will be accusative. Ace is a preposition that means unto. And we see that in the Latin text, in the Vulgate, St. Jerome translated it with the preposition in. Notice that when we look at St. Jerome's translation from Greek into Latin, not only do we have a translation from a church father, which is pretty awesome, but we've also got St. Jerome's work of interpretation. So not only is it a translation, it's also an interpretation because, excuse me, because St. Jerome knows that there are a number of possible words he could use when he translates the Greek into Latin, and he's got to make a choice. And those choices that he makes are choices of interpretation. So not only do we have a translation by a church father, one of the most famous and ancient church fathers, but we've also got this Catholic interpretation coming from the mind of St. Jerome, which is very helpful to us. It not only helps us to understand the Greek, it also helps us to understand the Latin. And our knowledge of Latin, thanks to St. Jerome, helps us to understand the Greek. So we see he translated this preposition ace as in, or which in English is translated unto. We then see the phrase ta idia. Ta idia, we see that ta is a definite article, and idia is an adjective, which means his own. Ta idia. And in Latin, we saw the equivalent was propria, his own things. To his own, ta idia. Okay, eis ta idia. And when you have a preposition, you should always focus on translating the whole phrase. So think of it as eis ta idia, unto his own. Okay. Now it says the here because it's the article, but the purpose of the definite article is just to restrict the object or the subject, to restrict the idea to some specific limited group or individual. Okay. So ta can be translated the, or you could just sort of ignore it in English and say his own, right? Unto his own, and then we have the verb eilthen, eilthen. And we see that this is translated as he came, past tense, and we see that St. Jerome translated it in Latin with a perfect tense verb. Okay, again, that's the help of the interpretation of St. Jerome. So eilthen. Now, if you looked up this verb eilthen in a dictionary, you wouldn't find it because that's not the dictionary form of the verb. The form of the verb that you would look up in the dictionary is erkomai, which is pretty wild. It's so different than this form. It's erkomai, epsilon rho is the beginning of the spelling, erkomai. But this past tense form here is eilthen. And we'll get into these forms when we study Greek grammar together. We've got a few more lessons in Greek grammar on orthography, which is about letters and syllables and sounds, and then we'll get into declension and conjugation of verbs. But eilthen is a past tense verb form from the verb erkomai, which is pretty difficult to see the connection. Okay, but it means he came. So eis ta idia eilthen. Translate the whole phrase. Eis ta idia eilthen. Unto his own he came. And in Latin, that's in propria venit. Unto his own he came. Kai hoi idioi. Kai hoi idioi. Kai is a conjunction that means and, similar to Latin et. Kai, and then we have the phrase hoi idioi. Hoi is the plural definite article, and idioi is the same adjective we saw up here, idia, but notice that it's masculine, and this was neuter. That's significant because obviously something is being signified by that, right? The gender changes. In the first case, ta idia means his own, and we assume things, right? His own things. To his own things he came. But then in the second phrase, hoi idioi is now masculine, and it seems to be referring to people. All right, so kai hoi idioi means and his own, and we can sort of put people in parentheses there, just like we could put things in parentheses with ta idia. Kai hoi idioi, and his own. Then we have the object auton, which is the pronoun that means him. Him, ou is the adverb, like the Latin non, it means not, ou, and then the verb parelabon, and we see that down here, parelabon, which means they did receive or they received, but it's ou parelabon, so it means they did not receive, okay? So verse 11 reads, unto his own things he came, and his own people, him did not receive. Him not did receive. Eis ta idia eothen, kai hoi idioi auton u parelabon. Unto his own he came, and his own him not did receive. Okay, verse 11. On to verse 12. Verse 12. Take a minute and read this on your own. Verse 12. Hopefully you can see it well enough. Verse 12. Just take it one phrase at a time and practice the pronunciation. Pay attention to breathing marks and accents. Verse 12. All right. So verse 12, we start out with this word hosoi. You can see that it's got a rough breathing mark at the beginning. Hossoi, hossoi, de elabon, elabon, soft breathing and an acute accent. Hossoi de elabon auton. Edoken, edoken, autois, autois, exousian, tekna, theu, genesthai, genesthai, tois, pisteusin, that's a tough one, pisteusin, it's got two diphthongs in there. Pisteu, that's one diphthong. That's a second diphthong, omicron, upsilon. Pisteusin, eis to onoma autou. To read it quickly, verse 12. Hosoi de elabon auton, edoken autois exousian tekna theu genesthai. Tois pisteusin eis ta onoma autou. Hosoi, hosoi in Greek is an adjective noun, translates as however many, comparable to the Latin quote, quote. Hosoi, however many. You can kind of remember that easily by the ho in the beginning of hosoi and however. Hosoi, however, as a little memory device there. Hosoi, however many. And then de is a conjunction. However, however many, however, quote, quote, autem in Latin. However many, and that's referring back to hoi idioi in verse 11, right? His own, they did not receive him. Hosoi de, however, however many, elabon, that's our verb, elabon, did receive, it's past tense. However many did receive auton, him. Notice that this is the object of the verb elabon, so it's set in the accusative case, auton. And again, we'll study all of these forms in Greek grammar. Hosoi de elabon auton, as many as or however many received him. Edoken, edoken, he gave. Edoken, he gave. Autois, this is dative plural, he gave to them. Notice the dative ending is translated with the preposition in English to. He gave to them exousian. What did he give to them? He gave them exousian. Exousian, which means power, potestatem in Latin. Edoken autois exousian. He gave to them power. What kind of power? What power for what? Tekna, which is children or sons, tekna, sons, theu, of God, sons of God, genesthai, to become, genesthai. Notice at the beginning of that word, if we transliterate it, you'd have genes, like Genesis, the beginning or the creation, right? So edoken autois exousian teknatheu genesthai. He gave to them power, sons of God, to become. So what kind of power did he give to those who received him? He gives to them power to become sons of God. Now theologically speaking, you'll hear people outside the Catholic Church talk about salvation by faith alone, and we can see that that's clearly not what Scripture teaches. Those who receive Christ, that's what it means to believe, right? That's what it means to have faith, to receive him. Those who receive him, they don't just get promised that they'll go to heaven. That's not the gospel. That if you believe in Jesus, you get like a card to stick in your wallet and present when after you die. That's not the doctrine of salvation. It's better than that. It's better than that if you actually want to be good, because as many as received him, he gave to them power, which is what we need. We need strength. We need power. He gave to them power power that allows us to become sons of God. And what it means to become sons of God is to actually become imitators of God. It doesn't mean to become bad sons. It's not like, I want to be a disobedient, wicked son, but hey, at least I'm a son, right? No, a son is obedient, right? The commandment is honor your father and your mother. A son is obedient. And so Jesus gives to us the power to become obedient children of God. And we see that in the gospel with the gift of the Holy Spirit and the sacraments and how God gives us grace and so on. But this idea of salvation by faith alone, it's too easy to prove false. The only person that would be interested in that idea is a person who wants to go to heaven, but who doesn't actually want to be good, which is really like a crazy person. We get back to the crazy people I always talk about. So Christ, for as many as received him, he gave to them power, sons of God to become. And then we have tois pisteusin eis ta onoma autou. So what does it mean to receive him? What does it mean to receive him? He gave this tois to those pisteusin that believe. So tois is translated like to those who pisteusin, who believe, eis, in ta'onoma, the name, autou, of him. And so we saw this pronoun 3 times in this passage. Here we see autou, which is genitive, so it's translated of him, autou, the genitive case. Here we saw autois, which is the dative plural form, translated to them, plural and dative, to them. And then here we saw the accusative case, auton, which means him as an object. So it's worth noting that in that verse 12, we see the pronoun autos in 3 different forms: auton, autois, plural, and then autou, singular. All right? So to read that again, hosoi de elabon auton, edoken autois exousian, teknateu genestai, tois pisteusin, eis to onoma autou. However many, however, received him, he gave to them power, sons of God to become, to those who believe in the name of him, or in his name. That's verse 12. Okay. So what does it mean to receive Christ? It means to believe in his name. Verse 13. And now we learn more about these people who receive him. Verse 13. Go ahead, take a minute and read that for yourselves. Verse 13. Pay attention to breathing marks and accents. Take your time. Read it one phrase at a time. Verse 13. All right, verse 13. We see hoi. Hoi, you see the rough breathing mark over that iota. It's a diphthong. So the accent and the breathing mark are over the second vowel, showing us it's a diphthong. Hoi. Then we see uk. We've got another diphthong here, but a soft breathing mark. So we've got hoi, uk, x. Then we've got another diphthong here, alpha iota, with a rough breathing mark. So that's pronounced hi, haimaton. Hoi, uk, ex, haimaton, ude, ek, thelematos, sarkos, ude, ek, thelematos, andros, al, ek, theu, egene, thesan, egene, thesan. And when you get to these difficult words like Haimaton is pretty difficult your first time through. Thelematos might be difficult. Egenethesan is definitely difficult your first time through. Just break it down into syllables. Gen, ne, the, san. Pretty simple if you break it into syllables, okay? And then practice reading it slowly, get the accent on the right syllable, and then just recite it a few times until you're at normal reading speed. So to read it quickly through, hoi uk ex haimaton, ude ek thelematos sarkos, ude ek thelematos andros, al ek theu egenethesan. All right, let's walk through the translation here. Hoi is translated who. It refers back to those people we were talking about, to those who received him, to those who believe in his name. They who, it continues that topic as we get into verse 13. They who, continuing to describe those people, uk is an adverb that means non. Uk ex haimaton. We have a prepositional phrase here. Ex haimaton. We see ex means out of, and you can see how that transliterates into the Latin word ex. So that word just moves right into Latin from Greek. Ex. Hoi uk ex haimaton, and haimaton is translated of bloods. It's of because it's the genitive case, it's plural, and therefore it's got this plural translation of bloods. And that may be significant. You'd have to look up a commentary to find out what the actual interpretation of that is. It's worth noting that Jerome translated it with a plural noun in Latin. So it's got this idea of plural, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be translated as a plural, because we've seen other places where, especially in Latin, we see, like, for example, tenebrae in Latin, it literally means shadows, but it translates with the singular English idea of darkness, right? So of bloods, it could mean different bloods, like different races, right? Different kinds of people, which would make sense. Or it could just mean of blood with an idea in the singular. But anyway, those people, so we're talking about those who receive him. We're learning more about them, more qualities of those people. Those people who not out of bloods, and I think that that can best be interpreted as out of different races, out of a certain race, right? So what causes a person to be a Christian, what causes a person to become a son of God is not that he belongs to a certain race. Remember, Christianity moves from a Jewish religion that was really open only to Jewish people to a religion that's intended for the whole human race. So it doesn't matter what race you belong to in terms of nationalities and things like that. So these are people who are not from certain bloods or races, not out of bloods. Then we have ude, which is translated nor. It connects a number of multiple negative conjunctions, or it serves as a conjunction when there's a number of negatives being said, like neque in Latin. Ude nor, ek thelematos sarkos, ude ek thelematos sarkos, nor out of thelematos, that's the word for the will, translated voluntate in Latin, thelematos, of the will, not out of the will, sarkos, of the flesh, sarkos, of the flesh, not out of the will of the flesh. So it's not just a matter of human choosing. Ude ek thelematos andros, nor out of the will of man, again appealing to the will of man as if he is the source of this belief, not by blood, not by the will of the flesh, not by the will of man, al ek theu, but out of or from God. egenethesan. They were born, translated nati sunt in Latin, egenethesan. And notice the connection between this verb, egenethesan, and the verb we saw in the previous verse, genesthai, right? You see that root gen in there, egenethesan, a different form that relates and refers back to that other verb, genesthai. Okay, so verse 13, those not of bloods, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God, they were born. Nati sunt in Latin. Okay, so in verse 12, we learn to those who received him, for as many as received him, he gave to them power to become sons of God, to those who believe in his name. And it's not a matter of coming from certain bloods, not out of bloods, nor out of the will of the flesh of man, nor out of the will of man, but of God they have been born. They were born. All right. So this is teaching us that difference, remember, there was some who did not receive him. He came to his own and his own did not receive him. But some did receive him. And St. John is making the distinction and explaining that the reason why some did receive him was because they were born by God. They were born again by the power of God. Ek theu egenethesan. They were born out of God. God produced, or God not produced. I wouldn't say produced. I would say God moved them and gave them grace to believe. So it's mysterious why some believe and why some don't. The reason why some believe is because God is giving them grace and they are collaborating with that grace. They're receiving that grace and acting on that grace. That's one of the reasons why we're told not to judge other people, because we often think about ourselves and how we think and how we act, how we choose to act. And we just sort of take credit for it. Like, well, that's just the way I am. That's the way I do things. That's the way I think, as if we just came up with these ideas ourselves, or we're so good. But really, we're under the influence. We're under the influence of God's grace. And that grace causes us and assists us and helps us to become what we are. And when we look at other people, we may be looking at people who have not yet received God's grace. And so the difference between us is not just that we're smart and they're dumb, or we're good and they're bad. It could also be just a different time in our lives in God's providence where we've already received grace. For example, you're, what, 14 years old, 13 years old, 18 years old, studying in a Catholic family, studying classical Catholic studies. When I was your age, I was an unbeliever, just like left to the world. And if you were an 18-year-old and you saw me at 18, you'd be like, man, what a jerk that guy is. But within the next year, if you would have come back and met me again the next year, you'd say, wow, this is a totally different person, because it was at that time in my life that God gave me grace and helped me to convert. And it was a radical change in my life. And so if you take a snapshot of different people, it's really not fair to judge them, because many people are the way they are because they don't have grace, or they don't understand grace that God is giving to them, or they're not collaborating with that grace, whereas you may take that grace for granted because you've been immersed in it your whole life. You may even despise it. You may yourself be blessed in a million different ways and not be making the best use of that grace. So we're taught here in the Gospel of John that the reason why some came to believe in him, why some received him, was because they were born again. They were born of God. There was something at work in them that was beyond them. Christ gave them power to become sons of God. So there's some mystery there. I don't want to get into all the details of that. It's a very complicated subject, but you can see that there's something being said here of God working in some people so that they were different and they did receive him, whereas He came to others and they did not receive him. Okay? Verse 13. On to verse 14. So go ahead and read verse 14 here. Take a minute, read through it. Hopefully you're reading this and not just staring at the screen. All right, verse 14. Kai ho logos. So keep the article and the noun together. Kai ho logos. So now we're appealing back to the logos that we talked about in the opening verses. Kai ho logos sarx egeneto. Kai ho logos sarx egeneto. Kai, and then we've got a difficult word here to pronounce. Eskenosen, eskenosen. Remember, just break it into syllables. Eskenosen, eskenosen. En hemin, en hemin. Kai hologos sarx egeneto, kai eskenosen en hemin. Kai, here's another hard word to pronounce. Etheasametha. 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 So you see how just read it one syllable at a time, take your time, and then just put it together, get the accent on the right syllable, and then recite it until you get it up to normal speed. Etheasametha. Etheasametha. Kai etheasametha ten doxan, ten doxan autu, ten doxan autu, doxan hos, note the rough breathing, hos monogenous, monogenous para patros, patros, pleres, pleres, caritos, caritos, kai, and this one can be tricky too because there's a bunch of vowels in there. Aletheias, aletheias, aletheias. One note here, make sure you notice the difference between the letter xi, right, pronounced like the Latin X. Xi looks like a squiggly uppercase E, and the ki, which actually looks like an X, but is pronounced like the hard CH in English chorus. And this word caritos, we're going to see that that means charity. All right, so to read this quickly here. Kai hologos sarx egeneto, kai eskenosen en hemin, kai etheasametha ten doxan autu, doxan hos monogenous parapatros, pleres caritos, kai aletheias. So let's look at the translation. It's 140, so we're making pretty good time here. I don't mean to rush too fast. I just want to make sure I get through all of this in one video and try to not have it be 4 hours long. So first we've got the conjunction kai, which means and, simple enough. Then we've got the phrase ho logos, which means the word, ho logos. We then have sarx, which is a substantive noun meaning flesh. And notice that before in an earlier verse, we have sarx here. So see the spelling there, sigma alpha rho xi, sarx. In the previous verse, we saw sarkos. Sarkos, that's the same noun, same exact word, just a different case. Here we see the genitive case in verse 13. That's the genitive case. And then in verse 14, we see sarx in the nominative case. So sarx here is actually the form that you would see in a dictionary, okay? Sarx and then sarkos is genitive. So, and the word flesh, egeneto. The word flesh became or was made. Notice the Latin translation from St. Jerome was factum est, which means was made. And the word was made flesh. Notice in that verb egeneto, again, we've got this root, gen. We've seen that 3 times now. We saw genesthai, right? We saw, what was it in the previous? Egenetheson in verse 13. Egenetheson, we see that same root, gen. And then we see it here once more, egeneto, okay? Egeneto. We see that gen root in those 3 different verbs. So, and the word flesh became, or the word flesh was made. Kai and eskenosen. Eskenosen, which means he dwelt. We see the Latin habitavit, he dwelt. The word became flesh, or the word was made flesh, and he dwelt. In the middle of that, you see this root skein. In Greek, that root means a tent or a place of dwelling. Hey, think of the English word scene, right? The scene of a play, right? Scene. That's from the Greek skene, all right? Kai hologos, and the word flesh was made, and eskenosen, and he dwelt. The word made flesh, dwelt, en hemin. En hemin. Now, hemin here is the pronoun that means us. And en is the simple preposition that means in, right? It's translated in Latin. But when you say in us, that really, I don't know. Is that what it means, right? He dwelt in us, or he dwelt among us, or with us, right? So that preposition en followed by the dative case, emin, can have a number of different possible translations. And those translations are important because they change the meaning of the phrase, right? He dwelt in us, he dwelt with us, he dwelt among us. They have different ideas in those different translations. But it's worth noting that St. Jerome just translated it in nobis, which really doesn't help us at all. It leaves us uncertain. So you see, this is a good example of where, when people say, oh, I don't like to interpret the Bible, I just read a translation. There's no such thing as a translation that doesn't include interpretation. That's why you should never read a non-Catholic Bible translation, because the interpretation that's coming from someone's wacky ideas is going to get into the translation, and then you're going to read something and think that the Bible has some wacky story in it, when in fact that's just a bad translation because it's from the interpretation of a crazy person. All right. So he dwelt among us. We can look to a Catholic Bible to see what the translation is and trust in that, right, as the interpretation. So the word flesh was made, and he dwelt among hemin, us. Kai etheasametha, and etheasametha, we beheld, we saw, vidimus in Latin. We beheld. So he became flesh, the word became flesh, which was invisible. The word became flesh and became visible, became a man and dwelt among us, and we saw. We saw, etheasametha, we beheld. What did we behold? Tein doxan autou. Tein doxan autou. Tein doxan. Doxan is glory. You see, in Latin, it's just gloriam. We beheld the glory of him. We beheld his glory. If you're interested in church music, you'll know that doxology. Doxology is praise, right? We give glory to God in a doxology. All right, so we beheld his glory, and then we should ask the question, if we're reading this in the sacred scripture class, we'd ask, well, what does that mean? What does it mean we beheld his glory? Just keep that in mind, because we're going to see what that means in coming chapters. We beheld his glory. This is St. John, right? Remember, St. John was there. St. John was one of those who received him, who believed in him. And when the word was made flesh, John says, we beheld his glory. We saw his glory. We saw him. We lived with him. We saw his glory. And you could ask, what kind of glory? What do you mean glory? We saw his glory. And John continues and says, the glory, hos, which means as if, the Latin quasi makes it clear. Glory, such a glory as if, not the glory of a famous person, not the glory of a rich man, not the glory of a king, but we beheld his glory, glory as if of monogenous, parapatros, as if of the only begotten. That word monogenous means only begotten. Notice son is in parenthesis there. It's added because it's masculine, right? As of the only begotten son, unigeniti in Latin. Parapatros, from the Father. Pleres, full, plenum in Latin. Pleres, caritos kai aletheas. What is he full of? He is full of caritos, grace or charity. That's literally charity, translated grace. Pleres caritos, full of grace, kai aletheas, and truth, full of grace and truth. And if you think about that, what is he full of? He's full of grace and truth. Grace has to do with, the will, right? Charity or kindness of the will. He was full of love or grace with respect to his will, and he was full of truth with respect to his intellect and his thought, right? So we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and of truth, or full of charity and of truth. So there's our exposition. To read it one more time, verse 14. Kai hologos sarx egenita, and the word flesh became, kai eskenos en hemin, and dwelt among us, kai etheasametha ten doxan autou, and we beheld the glory of him. Doxan hos monogenous parapatros, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, pleres caritos kai aletheas, full of grace and of truth. Verse 14. Verse 15. Let's wrap up here. Go ahead and read verse 15. Practice pronunciation. Read verse 15 to yourself. All right, verse 15. First up, the name Ioannes. 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 Notice the double nu in there. You should try to get both of those nus. Ioannes. Ioannes. Try to get both of them. Ioannes. Marturei. Marturei. Circumflex accent at the end, the diphthong. Marturei. Peri autou. Peri autou. Peri autou. Kai. Hekragen. Hekragen. Legon. Legon. Hutos. Hutos. Notice the rough breathing and the circumflex accent. Hutos. Ein. Ein. Hon. Make sure you notice the rough breathing. Hon. Apon. Apon. Ho. Opiso. Opiso. Mu. Erkomenos. Erkomenos. Remember before I said eilthen comes from the verb erkomai? That's the same verb there. Erkomenos here. That's the verb I was talking about for eilthen. Back up, I think, in verse 11. Erkomenos, erkomenos. Emprosthen, emprosthen. Mu, gegonen, gegonen. Hoti, hoti. Protos, protos. This is a strange word because it's got two accents on it. It's got a circumflex accent over the omega, and then it's got an acute at the end. The reason why it's got this acute at the end is because it's followed by a particle that doesn't have any accent. So this is to be read like a phrase with this double accent. Protosmu, protosmu, ein. All right, so verse 15, I'll read it quickly one time and then we'll go through it. Ioannes marture periautu kai kekragen legon, hu tos ein hon eipon. Ho opiso mu erkomenos, emprosthen mu gegonen, hoti protos mu ein. Verse 15. Ioannes, obviously John, transliterated as Ioannes in Latin. Marturei, notice the word here. This is where we get the English word martyr from. Notice M-A-R-T, and then you've got the upsilon, which becomes a Y in English. Marturei, he bears witness. What is a martyr? A martyr is someone who bears witness to the truth. How does a martyr do that? When we think of the use of the word martyr, by giving his life for it, right? He is so convinced that he's willing to die for the sake of his testimony. But really, that word just means to give witness. So John, Ioannes marture, he gives witness, and he ended up being put to death for his witness. He ended up becoming a martyr, John the Baptist. Ioannes marture periautu, concerning him, about him. Now, notice just a grammar note here. Notice peri is a preposition, and it's followed by a genitive case, okay? In Latin, the preposition peri in Latin is equivalent to the preposition de in Latin. Sorry if I didn't say that right. Peri in Greek is equivalent to de in Latin. But de is followed by the ablative case, de ipso, whereas peri in Greek is followed by the genitive case. Remember, there is no ablative case in Greek. So most of the use of the ablative in Latin becomes genitive in Greek, or was genitive in Greek. So we have periautu, which is equivalent to de ipso, concerning him. Kai, and then we have the verb kekragen, kekragen. He cried, kekragen. Notice at the beginning of this Greek verb, you have this repetition of a consonant sound, kekra, kekra. That repetition of that consonant sound, the kappa, that's a sign of a past tense verb. We'll learn about that when we get to conjugations in Greek grammar. But if you see a doubled consonant sound at the beginning of a word, it's usually a sign of a past tense. Kekragen, kekragen. He cried. Legon is a participle, so it works like an adjective, but it has time like a verb. Legon, saying, present participle. Legon, saying. And these are the words of John the Baptist. So we have Ioannes marture periautu kai kekragen legon. John bears witness concerning him and cried out, saying, and then we have this colon, and then we have the words of John as the rest of verse 15. So John says this, hutos, this, and it's masculine, so we can say this man. Hutos, this ein, we've already seen that verb throughout chapter 1, was. This was hon. This was hon. It's translated whom, or it could be he whom, or him whom. This was him whom. Apon, I said. Apon. Past tense verb, I said. Translated as dixi in Latin. This was him whom I said. And now this gets complicated because now John is being quoted by Saint John, but John is actually quoting himself. So now we've got this like quote within a quote within a quote here. So John says, this was him whom I said, quote, ha, the one, or he who, opiso, after, and then mu is me. So we have opiso mu as a prepositional phrase. Opiso plus the genitive. Opiso mu, after me. The one who after me erkomenos, another participle. The one who after me is coming, we could say. It's like an adjective, but it's got time. The one who after me erkomenos is coming. Emprosthen mu. Emprosthen is a big long preposition. Emprosthen mu, before me, gegonen, was made. Notice here also the doubling of that initial consonant sound in a past tense verb. Gegonen, guga, gega. Kekragen, kekra, gega. Okay. So John says, the one who after me is coming. This is a mysterious, bizarre, prophetic statement. The one who after me is coming before me was made. And now you could say, okay, that's interesting. It's not really a big deal. He's just saying the guy who's coming after me is older than me, right? The guy who's coming after me, somebody older is coming, but that's not true. John is older than Jesus. Remember, Saint Elizabeth was already pregnant with John when Mary was told by the angel Gabriel that she would conceive. John is older in the flesh than Jesus, but he says, this man came before me. This man was made, sorry. This man was made before me. This man who comes after me was made before me. Now this gets really, but wait a minute. You're talking about Jesus. He's actually younger than you. How was he made before you? You can see the mysteriousness of what John is saying. The one who after me is coming before me was made. Hoti, because protos mu, before me or prior to me, ein, he was. And that he was is significant because if you think when Moses asks God, what is your name? God says to Moses, I am. He has this, it's just the one who exists, the one who is. That's how God is rightly thought of and spoken of. He's the one who always is. He was never made. He never had a beginning, will never had an end. And so when John says, because, the one who is coming after me was made before me, because before me he was. There's just lots of significance in that language, okay? He was relates to I am, right? You see that connection, the same verb? And it's referring back to this idea that John has introduced to us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And now John the Baptist is saying, the one who is coming after me was made before me because before me he was. You see how this is referring back to this idea of in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt. That mystery of the incarnation is what John has expressed or announced, what he bears witness to as a prophet. He says, the one who is coming after me was made before me because before me he was. So we see the same message in the teaching of John the Baptist. He was the first to proclaim it. And that brings us to the end of verse 15. So quickly, let me read this. I know we're over time. We got a lot done though, so it's good. Verse 15, Ioannes marture periautu kai kekragen legon, hu tos ein hon eipon. Ho opiso mu erkomenos, emprosten mu gegonen, hoti protos mu ein. So that's verses 11 through 15. We were able to get through all of it. We practiced pronunciation. We went through the exposition of all the vocabulary and the translation, talked about some issues along the way, and we're done. So that's all for today's lesson in Greek reading. That's lesson 3 in Greek reading 1. For anyone who's going to be watching this on a recording, just so you know, these lessons, you may find them on YouTube, but these lessons are part of a course, a Greek reading course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which you're welcome to join us for. But here we've gone through verses 11 through 15 of Chapter 1. We do this for both Greek and Latin. We go through the readings one word at a time, learn all the meanings and translation, build our vocabulary, practice pronunciation, and so on. So I hope that's helpful for those of you who are here live. If there's anything you want to chat about, I'm going to end the recording and then I'll be available to chat if you want. Otherwise, you're free to go. But I hope that was helpful, and it's your turn to go study now and get this stuff done. All right? God bless. Thank you for joining me here.